The sun was a dull, orange smear against the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long shadows over the narrow valley where the small town clung to life. The wind whispered through the pines like a warning, carrying with it the scent of smoke from distant fires and the faint temps of iron from the mines. Folks in the valley had long learned to respect the mountains, and the mountains, in turn, demanded their own terms. Life here moved slowly, and secrets ran deep hidden in the folds of the hills. In the walls of weathered cabins, and in the hearts of the people who dared to call this harsh land home, the mountain man was the kind of figure that drew eyes and hushed conversations wherever he went. He wasn't cruel exactly, but he was a force of nature, as rugged and untamed as the cliffs that rose above his cabin. His presence alone could unsettle a crowd. He carried himself with a quiet authority that made people wary. Some said he had lived here longer than anyone could remember, wandering the forests, hunting game, and speaking to the land as if it were a friend. Others whispered stories of deals struck in shadowed glens, and bargains sealed by the flickering light of campfires. Most folks steered clear, not from fear alone, but because the mountain man moved to a rhythm no one else could understand, a rhythm that promised both danger and survival in equal measure. It was on a chill morning, when the frost clung stubbornly to the branches and the air smelled like wet earth and pine sap, that the mountain man appeared at the edge of the village. Word spread fast. He had come for a bargain. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the crowd, lingering on one figure with a weight that made the villagers shift uneasily in the snow. The woman at the center of the whispers had always been known for her strength, a quiet resilience that had carried her through the winters alone. Yet there was a tremor in her hands and a tension in her shoulders as she faced the man whose reputation preceded him. "Your body is mine until my sons come into the world," he said, his voice low but carrying, the words slicing through the morning stillness. No one moved, no one dared interrupt. Even the wind seemed to pause. The sentence hung there, unnatural and unyielding, a shock that penetrated the village gossip like a knife. It was not just a claim. It was a promise and a warning wrapped into one. People exchanged uneasy glances, some of them skeptical, some of them frightened. But the woman said nothing. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes met his without blinking, as if challenging the mountains themselves to tremble. There was a history here, a reason no one fully understood. And it had led to this moment, a moment that would change everything for the people who lived at the base of the peaks. The mountain. Man's bargain was not just about him. It was about the generations to come, about bloodlines and legacies, about power that belonged to the mountains as much as it did to the men who roamed them. Whispers had long told of his sons, of the promise that one day they would carry forward his ways, his knowledge, and his claim over the valley. The villagers, raised on stories of survival and respect, felt a chill even as they tried to understand the layers of meaning in his words. Some wondered if she had a choice, others if the mountain man ever allowed choice at all. But beneath the fear, curiosity sparked what had led her to this. What secrets had been kept hidden behind her calm exterior, and what would she risk to defy the force of a man who was both feared and respected? In the cabin where the woman had lived quietly for years, the walls seemed to close in around her as the reality of the bargain settled like snow on her shoulders. Memories of past winters, of quiet days spent tending small gardens and weaving stories with her neighbors, clashed violently with the present, where the mountain man's words weighed heavier than any storm she had endured. She could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, the wind scratching at the windows, and the low hum of the mountains themselves. It was as though nature had paused to witness her hesitation, to test her resolve. And yet, despite the fear, there was a spark of determination in her gaze, a flicker that refused to bow entirely to the man whose shadow loomed over her life. Outside, the village began to stir. Men and women went about their business with glances stolen toward the mountain man and the woman who had captured his attention. Children played too close to the riverbank, oblivious to the tension threading through the air. Their laughter, a fragile counterpoint to the unease settling over the adults. Old-timers muttered under their breaths about bargains, bloodlines, and the strange ways of the mountains, their voices carrying the weight of experience and caution. They remembered the deals struck in the past, the promises made that had shifted the balance of life and death in this valley. Some of those promises had been kept, others broken, and now, as the mountain man waited with patience, as sharp as the edge of his hunting knife, the village felt the hush of anticipation, the pull of a storm that had yet to arrive. The woman, alone in her cabin, knew the days ahead would be a test of will and spirit. She thought of the forests where she had learned to track the deer and the streams where she had fished to survive. She remembered the sound of wolves calling in the distance, the way the earth felt solid beneath her boots, and the comfort of nights spent beneath the stars. All of that was familiar and safe, yet it felt fragile now, as if one wrong move could shatter the quiet life she had built. The mountain man's presence was an intrusion, but not merely into her home. It was an intrusion into her life, her future, and the choices she had hoped would remain hers alone. She could not yet know how the bargain would unfold, or what would be demanded of her in the months to come. The mountain man was a puzzle, a force whose intentions were tangled with the ancient rhythms of the mountains, and whose methods were as unpredictable as the winter storms that swept through the valley. Even the villagers, who had witnessed countless seasons and weathered hardships beyond imagining, felt a tension that clung to the air like frost. Every glance, every gesture between the mountain man and the woman carried weight, and every step she took toward the uncertain days ahead was a step into shadows that promised both danger and revelation by dusk. The mountains themselves seemed to lean closer, their peaks glowing red in the fading light. The air was thick with expectation, with questions too large for anyone to answer. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward the cabin where she had disappeared, wondering what choice she would make and what price the mountain man expected in return. And inside, as the first stars began to pierce the twilight, the woman stood at her window looking out over the valley, feeling the weight of a bargain that could alter not just her life, but the lives of generations yet unborn. There was fear, yes, but also a determination that had been forged through hardship and solitude. Whatever came next, she knew the mountains would watch, and that the mountain man's claim, bold and shocking, was only the beginning of a story that was far from finished. The night deepened, and the wind carried a chill that made the fire crackle louder in her hearth. Outside, the forest whispered secrets that only those who dared to listen could understand. She clenched her fists and took a deep breath, aware that the hours ahead would demand more courage than she had ever known. And then, as the shadows stretched and the stars blinked above, the mountain man's voice echoed faintly in her memory, sharp and unrelenting. "Your body is mine until my sons come into the world." The words were both a warning and a challenge, and she realized with a tightening chest that there was no turning back. Some bargains, she understood, were meant to test the limits of survival. Some promises were designed to bind hearts and lives together in ways that could not be undone. And as the wind rustled through the peaks, carrying with it the scent of pine and smoke, she felt the tension of the mountains pressing close, reminding her that the days ahead would demand every ounce of strength, cunning, and courage she possessed. The story had begun, and the first chapter ended not with resolution, but with the kind of suspense that leaves the soul restless, wondering what dawn might bring in a valley where bargains and bloodlines held sway. The valley had always been a place where history lingered like morning mist. Curling around the trees and clinging to the stone walls of old homesteads, the villagers often spoke of the mountain man not just in whispers of fear, but in stories filled with awe. Some claimed his ancestors had settled these peaks long before the town existed, living by rules that were older than the law and older than memory itself. They said he had inherited more than land. He had inherited the mountain's secrets, the hidden streams, the paths that led to caves few dared to enter, and a knowledge of the weather and wild creatures that bordered on the uncanny. He was a man forged by the peaks, and the peaks, in turn, had shaped him into something both revered and feared. The woman had grown up in the valley too, though her roots were younger than the mountain man's and less tangled in the land's history. She remembered the stories her mother told her about survival, about relying on wit and strength when the world outside was cruel or indifferent. Her father had died before she could understand him fully, leaving her with a patchwork of memories and a stubbornness she would later discover was her greatest asset. She had learned to hunt, to track, to read the signs of the forest, and to keep her mind sharp when fear threatened to overwhelm her. The mountains had been her classroom, the streams her companions, and the wolves her unseen teachers. Every scar on her hands and every ache in her muscles reminded her of lessons learned the hard way, but nothing in her past had prepared her for the mountain man's claim. His words were not merely shocking, they were a weight that pressed down on her very soul. It was as though the mountains themselves had shifted to accommodate his presence, as if they, too, were curious to see how she would respond. Some nights when she lay awake, listening to the wind cut across the peaks, she tried to piece together the reasons behind his sudden claim. Was it tradition, or obsession, or something darker that twisted through his mind? The villagers whispered theories, each more unsettling than the last, but none held proof, and the mountain man offered none. His silence was as much a weapon as his presence, leaving her to navigate a maze of questions with no guide. The mornings after his declaration were heavy with tension. Villagers went about their routines with the careful precision of those who walk through a forest full of hidden traps. Men repaired fences with glances over their shoulders, women gathered firewood with hurried steps, and children were reminded to stay near home and avoid wandering too far into the trees. No one approached the mountain man directly, and few dared to approach the woman either, sensing the storm that surrounded her. The bond, he claimed, unspoken yet unmistakable, had already altered the rhythm of life in the valley. Nothing felt ordinary anymore. Inside her cabin, she began to notice subtle changes in herself. Her sleep was haunted by shadows of possibilities, by visions of the mountain man's sons growing into men like him, carrying forward the power of the mountains in ways she could not yet predict. She found herself tracing patterns in the snow outside her window, imagining the paths the mountain man might take, wondering what steps he would demand of her in the coming days. There was fear, certainly, but also a growing awareness that she could not rely on the villagers to protect her. The mountains were silent witnesses, but they were indifferent. She realized that the only protection she could muster would come from herself, from the skills she had honed over years of solitary survival. At the same time, she could not deny the curiosity that burned within her. The mountain man's presence was magnetic, impossible to ignore, and it pulled her attention whether she wanted it to or not. She remembered the first time she had seen him from a distance, moving through the forest with the ease of someone who belonged more to the wilderness than to the town. He had been watching the herd of deer near the ridge, his movements so precise, so calculated, that it was as if he were part of the land itself. There was a rhythm to his life that she had never known in the valley, a raw and untamed logic that made her uneasy and fascinated at the same time. And now, after his words, she realized that the mountain man's world had intersected with hers in a way that could not be undone. Her neighbors' reactions only deepened her unease. Some avoided her outright, giving her polite nods but keeping distance, as though the shadow of the mountain man extended further than she could see. Others lingered in conversation, speaking in low tones, their eyes darting to the mountains as though expecting some invisible force to respond to their words. Even the town's elders, who had lived through decades of hardship and knew the land's every secret, seemed unsettled. They whispered about bargains that had changed families, about bloodlines that carried both privilege and burden, about the subtle but undeniable truth that some claims could not be ignored. And through it all, the woman felt herself caught between the ordinary world of the village and the strange, magnetic pull of the mountains, where the mountain man reigned. She began to retrace the history of the land in her mind, trying to understand what gave him the right, in his own estimation, to make such a bold declaration. There were tales of old families, of rivalries that stretched back generations, of debts and promises carved into the stones of forgotten paths. Perhaps his claim was a continuation of something older, something no one alive could fully explain. Or perhaps it was something entirely personal, tied to his own code and his own view of survival and legacy. The mystery gnawed at her, blending with the fear that refused to leave her shoulders, creating a tension that made every sound in the forest feel amplified, every shadow more menacing. Days passed, each one stretching longer than the last. She took to walking the ridges at dawn, letting the cold air sharpen her thoughts. Tracking signs of wildlife and reading the snow for footprints that were not her own. It was during one of these early walks that she first glimpsed the mountain man again, distant but unmistakable. He stood at the edge of a cliff, gazing across the valley, his figure outlined by the rising sun. She caught only a moment of his profile before he disappeared into the trees. But that fleeting sight sent a jolt through her chest. The mountains had a new rhythm now, dictated in part by him. She felt the weight of his presence even when he was unseen. The nights were the hardest. Darkness seemed to press in closer, the wind carrying strange noises from deep within the forest. She often sat by the fire, her mind replaying every word he had spoken, every glance he had cast in her direction. The phrase, "Your body is mine until my sons come into the world," echoed constantly, its meaning shifting with each repetition. Was it a test? A warning? A prophecy? Or something altogether more complicated, entwined with the mountain man's own history and ambitions? She did not know. And that uncertainty was like a blade that never dulled. Then came the first signs of others taking an interest. Strangers began to appear on the edges of the valley. Men and women who claimed to be traders or travelers, but whose eyes lingered too long on her cabin and the surrounding peaks. The villagers whispered that they were connected to the mountain man, though no one could say why or what they sought. The woman began to notice footprints in the snow that did not belong to any animal, and objects left near the edge of the forest that were clearly not natural. The tension grew, wrapping the valley in a layer of unease that no one could shake. Even the mountain man's sons, though unseen, became a presence in the shadowed corners of her mind. Imagined figures who would one day step into the power their father had claimed. Despite all this, she refused to yield entirely. She sharpened her knives, tended her traps, and strengthened the defenses of her small cabin. She mapped the valley, noting the safest routes, the places where she could hide or flee if needed. And she practiced listening, really listening, to the forest and the wind, usher, to the subtle shifts that might warn her of approach or danger. The skills she had developed over years of solitary living became her armor, though she knew they might not be enough. The mountain man's claim, she realized with a sinking feeling, was just the first step in a story far larger than she could yet comprehend, even as fear and curiosity warred within her. She felt an undeniable pull toward understanding him, toward uncovering the man behind the legend. There were moments when she caught glimpses of something almost human beneath his fierce exterior, fleeting expression, a movement that betrayed thought rather than instinct. And in those moments, her mind filled with questions she dared not speak aloud. What had driven him to the mountains? What had shaped the man who now claimed so much of her life? And what exactly did he expect from her in return? The valley held its breath, waiting for the inevitable collision of forces the mountain man, the woman, the generations yet unborn, and the secrets buried deep in the forest and stone. Every shadow seemed to harbor possibility, every rustle in the trees a warning or a message. She knew that what lay ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. That the days and nights to come would demand courage, cunning, and perhaps sacrifice. And as the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the ridges in white and muffling the sounds of the valley, she felt the tension tighten like a coil around her chest. Somewhere beyond the peaks, the mountain man watched, patient and unyielding. Somewhere in the forest, secrets waited to reveal themselves. And somewhere inside her, determination and fear intertwined, creating a fragile balance that could tip with a single misstep. The story was far from over, the mystery unresolved, and the bargain still hanging like a shadow over everything she had ever known. The winter deepened, and the valley seemed to shrink under the weight of ice and shadow. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches scratching against the sky like claws, and the mountain peaks were hidden in low clouds that made the world feel smaller, tighter, and more dangerous. The mountain man's presence, once distant and almost legendary, now pressed in closer. A living reminder of the claim he had made. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the eyes of the mountains, and perhaps him, tracing her movements, assessing her, testing her limits. The tension between them was unspoken but palpable, like the hum before a storm, and it gnawed at her resolve, she began to notice small changes in the village. Subtle shifts that hinted at the mountain man's influence even where he had not set foot. Traders and travelers who passed through seemed unusually cautious, asking questions that hinted they knew more than they admitted. Children were warned to stay closer to home, and even the hunters in the woods began to avoid certain paths, speaking quietly to one another about the man who moved like a shadow through the mountains. There were whispers of unseen watchers, of footsteps following at a distance, and the villagers could not shake the feeling that the balance of their lives was tilting in a direction none of them could fully control. Inside her cabin, the woman wrestled with fear and strategy in equal measure. She had fortified the space as best she could, lining windows with sharpened stakes, checking traps and hidden routes for escape, and keeping the hearth burning constantly. She spent hours mapping the forest in her mind, imagining paths that could lead her to safety and marking those that might serve as traps. Her thoughts often drifted to the mountain man himself, to the intensity in his eyes, to the sheer force of will that seemed to radiate from him. There was something almost magnetic in his power, even when it frightened her. She knew she would have to understand it, perhaps even anticipate it, if she wanted to navigate the days ahead. At the same time, another layer of tension was creeping into her life, one she had not anticipated. The villagers, uneasy with the mountain man's claim, had begun to involve themselves in ways that made her uneasy. Some came to her door with advice, warnings, or outright demands, each believing they knew the best way to handle the situation. She had to navigate these conversations carefully, choosing words that would not reveal too much, avoiding anger that could spark conflict, and yet asserting her independence in ways that kept her dignity intact. It was a delicate balance, and each interaction left her both exhausted and more determined. She realized the battle was not only with the mountain man, but with the fears, loyalties, and secrets of the village itself. One evening, as snow fell heavily and the wind howled through the valley, a messenger arrived from a neighboring settlement. He brought news that travelers from distant towns had reported sightings of the mountain man's sons near the edge of the forests, moving silently, almost like shadows. The woman listened to the details carefully, noting every path mentioned, every timing reported. She felt a chill run through her body, not just from the cold, but from the realization that the story was growing larger than she had imagined. It was no longer only about her or the mountain man. The sons, the generations yet to come, were becoming part of a larger web, one she could not yet see in its entirety. Meanwhile, the mountain man continued his routines in the wilderness, unseen by most but felt everywhere. His movements through the forest were deliberate, careful, and full of purpose. Sometimes she caught glimpses of smoke rising from distant peaks, or the faint echo of a horn calling across a valley. It was as if he was marking the land, leaving messages in subtle ways, testing both her awareness and her courage. And as she observed, she began to realize that there were rules in his world that were invisible to the ordinary villagers' rules about survival. Observation and respect for the untamed. Breaking them could be fatal, yet understanding them could offer power, or at least a measure of safety. Tensions in the village escalated as well. Families who had lived side by side for generations began to argue over loyalty and fear. Some felt the mountain man's claim was a threat to the entire community, while others whispered that resisting him outright would be folly. The woman became a silent center of this storm, not by choice, but by circumstance. Villagers sought her opinion, looked to her actions, and speculated on what she might do next. Each decision she made or refrained from making carried weight. Every glance toward the forest, every trip outside the cabin, every conversation with a neighbor became part of a fragile dance that could tip the balance at any moment. Amid all this, she discovered small clues to the mountain man's past that hinted at deeper motivations. An old journal she found hidden in her cabin. Left by previous inhabitants who had lived near the peaks, she read mentions of alliances, disputes, and legends about men who had claimed the mountains as their own. These accounts painted a picture of a man bound by traditions older than the village itself, a man whose promises were not given lightly and whose vengeance, when roused, could be merciless. The words resonated in her mind, filling the quiet hours with questions she could not ignore. How much of his claim was personal desire, and how much was a fulfillment of ancient codes she barely understood? One day, as she traveled along a ridge to scout the surrounding forest, she encountered a figure she had never seen before. A woman, older than anyone in the village, lived in a hidden cabin tucked between two cliffs. Her eyes were sharp and discerning, and she spoke with a quiet authority that immediately commanded respect. She offered cryptic warnings about the mountain man, hinting at things the valley had long forgotten. He does not act without reason, the elder said, and he does not forgive easily. You must learn the land as he does if you hope to survive what is coming. The woman listened carefully, weighing each word, realizing that this encounter could provide insight, but also danger. The elder's knowledge was a weapon, and like all weapons, it could cut both ways. The subplots of the village, the mountain man's sons, and the hidden histories intertwined in ways that created an almost unbearable tension. Every day brought new challenges. From the threat of harsh weather to the subtle manipulations of neighbors who acted out of fear or ambition, she became aware of allies and adversaries alike, some hidden, some obvious, and had to decide whom to trust, when, and to what extent. The forest itself seemed alive with the consequences of these choices, the wind carrying whispers of movement, and the snow masking evidence that could either protect her or betray her as the days lengthened into weeks. The mountain man himself appeared less frequently, yet his influence remained omnipresent. The woman began to leave small signs of her own in the forest traps that could warn her of approach, signals that could mislead or confuse, markers that she alone could read. She felt the tension build in every step, every glance, every sound. The landscape had become a living battlefield of strategy, fear, and anticipation, one where every action was magnified and every mistake could be fatal. Then came the first sign that the mountain man's sons were no longer a distant threat. Tracks appeared in the snow, larger than any human should leave, moving with a silent purpose that made her stomach tighten. She followed them cautiously, observing their patterns, noting the careful way they avoided signs of her presence. She began to understand the scope of the conflict she faced. It was not only about the mountain man's claim, but about generations, about legacy, and about forces she had yet to comprehend fully. Every moment of observation, every step she took, seemed to deepen the tension, to raise the stakes in ways that left her both frightened and resolutely focused. In the evenings, the village itself seemed to brace for confrontation. People stayed closer to home, doors were locked earlier, conversations ended abruptly when her name or the mountain man's was mentioned. The children sensed the unease, huddling by fires, listening to whispers of unseen forces and old promises. Even the livestock reacted, becoming restless in their pens. As if aware of the currents of fear and anticipation that flowed through the valley, she realized with a quiet dread that the conflict was no longer hers alone. It had grown, expanded into every corner of the valley, and would demand endurance, cleverness, and courage from anyone who lived there. At night, when she lay awake listening to the wind through the trees, she felt the story tightening around her like a net. The mountain man's claim, the village's unease, the sons moving through the forest, the hidden histories revealed in old journals, the warnings of the elder woman, all of it intertwined, forming a knot that seemed impossible to unravel. And yet, in the same moments, she sensed possibilities. Paths through the forest, opportunities to learn, chances to gain insight into the mountain man's world if she could survive long enough to see them clearly. Every sound outside her, cabin, every shadow in the trees, every step of the wind became part of the tension. Part of a narrative that would not release her until it had tested her completely. She realized that the conflict had many layers: the mountain man and his claim, the legacy of his sons, the villagers' fear and curiosity, the secrets of the mountains themselves, and her own struggle to survive and assert herself. Each layer intersected with the others in unpredictable ways, and every choice she made could alter the balance. The story was far from over, and the next steps she took would determine not only her fate, but the course of forces that had been in motion. Long before she had arrived in the valley, the snow fell thicker. muffling sounds and leaving the valley in a muted white stillness. Shadows deepened along the forest edges, and the peaks loomed like silent sentinels. She could sense the mountain man watching, or perhaps testing her from afar. She could feel the presence of his sons, growing closer, moving with purpose. And she could hear the heartbeat of the mountains themselves, steady, unyielding, waiting. Every instinct told her that the coming days would demand more than courage, they would demand intelligence, patience, and a willingness to confront the unknown. The conflicts had multiplied, the stakes had risen. And yet the resolution remained out of reach, hanging like mist over the valley. The story tightened around her life, and the lives of those in the village, and she understood in the deepest part of her being that she had only begun to navigate the forces at play. The tension was far from over, and the mountains were patient, holding their secrets close, watching to see who could endure, who could survive, and who could finally understand the power that moved unseen through the peaks. The wind had grown sharper, slicing across the ridges like knives, and the mountains loomed higher than ever in her mind, their jagged outlines etched with shadows that seemed to move. The valley, once a familiar place of survival and quiet routines, now felt like a trap, each step outside her cabin carrying the weight of unseen eyes. She moved cautiously, listening to the creak of the frozen trees, the distant groan of shifting ice, and the whisper of the wind that sounded almost like voices calling from the peaks. Each sound set her nerves on edge, each shadow seemed to stretch closer. The mountain man's presence, though rarely seen in person, was everywhere in the wind, in the snow. In the rhythm of the forest itself, her days were filled with careful observation, planning, and preparation. She moved along the ridges, following faint tracks left by his sons, trying to anticipate their intentions. Their patterns were deliberate, calculated, like soldiers testing the terrain, and the knowledge that they were watching, learning, adapting to her movements, made every decision heavier. She set traps and false trails, tested her limits in the bitter cold, and studied the forest for advantages she could use if confrontation came. Each day became a tightrope walk between survival and exposure, and the tension pressed on her chest like stone. The villagers, sensing the rising danger, began to act differently. Some grew fearful to the point of paranoia, whispering of curses and old grudges carried through generations. Others tried to rally support, forming small groups to patrol the outskirts of the forest or leave messages for the woman. Though the messages were often confusing, contradictory, and fueled more by rumor than fact. She had to navigate these layers carefully, taking the advice of the cautious while ignoring the reckless. Every interaction felt like a test, a trial that could tip the scales one way or another. And through it all, she realized that the mountain man's influence extended far beyond his own claim. He had changed the rhythm of the entire valley. No one could escape it. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, she noticed smoke rising from a ridge she had not seen before. Her heart tightened. It was a signal, she realized, deliberate and clear. The mountain man or his sons were near. She crouched behind a fallen tree, eyes scanning the shadows as the orange glow of fire flickered intermittently through the branches. For the first time, she felt the weight of the generations involved in this conflict, not just her own, not just the mountain man, but the sons who were becoming part of the story, whether she wished it or not. The stakes were rising, and there was no turning back. In the days that followed, the tension escalated in ways that were almost unbearable. Tracks multiplied in the snow, signals and markers appeared, and the forest seemed to tighten around her like a cage. She began to notice subtle changes in the mountain man's behavior glimpsed through careful observation from hidden vantage points. Sometimes he would appear at the edge of the forest, standing motionless for hours, as if listening to the valley itself. Other times, she would catch a flash of movement, shadow slipping through the trees so silently it could have been part of the wind. Each encounter, real or imagined, sent a shiver through her body, a reminder that she was part of a game larger than herself. A story woven with history, bloodlines, and the untamed wilderness. Meanwhile, the villagers' anxiety reached a boiling point. Families argued, old grudges resurfaced, and alliances shifted. Some openly questioned whether the mountain man's claim could be resisted at all. Others feared that to act against him would bring disaster to their homes and children. The woman watched these changes with a mix of caution and frustration. Understanding that the valley itself had become a battlefield of perception, rumor, and instinct. Each conversation, each glance exchanged in the town square carried weight, and she had to balance both her own survival and the fragile stability of the community she could not abandon. The elder woman in the hidden cabin returned at unexpected moments, offering cryptic advice and warnings. "The mountain does not forgive haste," she said one evening, her voice carrying through the trees. "The mountain man tests as much as he watches. Your strength will matter, but your patience will matter more." The words echoed in her mind long after the visitor left. She began to see the truth in them. The conflict was not only about confrontation, but about timing, strategy, and understanding forces that were older than the town itself. Every trap, every false trail, every subtle observation of the forest, and the mountain man's movements became part of a larger puzzle she had yet to solve. Tension also mounted within her own heart. Fear, curiosity, and a strange fascination coexisted in ways she could not easily unravel. The mountain man, though a figure of power and intimidation, had become a presence she could not ignore. She caught herself imagining him moving silently through the forest, observing, calculating, perhaps even anticipating her reactions. His sons were part of this web now too, emerging as unseen players whose intent she could only guess. Every shadow in the forest, every distant sound, felt like a signal, a test, or a warning. And she grew both exhausted and fiercely determined with every passing day. Snowstorms began to sweep through the valley, cutting visibility and masking the forest's natural signs. She used this to her advantage, moving carefully, laying false trails, and setting subtle signals to warn her of approaching footsteps. But the storms also brought isolation, leaving her alone for hours at a time in a landscape that seemed both familiar and foreign. Nights were the hardest, with wind whistling through the pines and the faintest noise amplified into something dangerous. She learned to move silently, to anticipate shifts in the terrain, and to trust instincts honed over years of survival. Though even that trust was sometimes shaken by the knowledge that the mountain man or his sons could appear anywhere unseen. Rumors circulated that one of the sons had been spotted closer to the village than ever before. Her anxiety spiked at the news. She began to plan for multiple possibilities at once: defense, retreat, confrontation, and observation. Each scenario required energy, patience, and cunning, and she felt herself stretched thinner with each passing day. Her sense of time blurred in the forest, and the rhythm of life was dictated by snow, wind, and the movements of those she could not see but could feel closing in. Meanwhile, small moments of the village added new layers to the story. She witnessed neighbors secretly leaving supplies at hidden locations, others marking trails with subtle signs that only she might understand. These acts of loyalty or fear created subplots that intertwined with her struggle, complicating decisions and increasing the pressure she felt. She began to realize that the story was no longer hers alone. It had become a web of intentions, fears, and strategies played out by the mountain man, his sons, and every villager touched by the shadows of the peaks. One late afternoon, she saw a figure appear at the edge of the forest, a young man, likely one of the sons, moving with an unnerving grace. He paused to study the land, to assess, to calculate. She held her breath, concealed behind a thicket, feeling both fear and a strange thrill. His awareness was keen, his movements precise, and it was clear he was not merely wandering. He was hunting, observing, testing the boundaries, and she understood then that the final confrontation, whatever form it would take, was approaching faster than she had anticipated. The nights that followed were sleepless, her mind racing with strategy, observation, and anticipation. She mapped the patterns of snow, studied the subtle signs of wildlife, and watched the forest with an intensity born of necessity. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of ice, every distant howl of wolves felt like part of a warning or a signal she could not ignore. The mountain man's influence stretched further than she could see, and the sun's presence added layers of unpredictability that made every movement dangerous. As the valley braced for what might come, she realized the stakes had never been higher. The mountain man's claim, the sun's shadowed approach, the villagers' fear, the secrets of the mountains, and her own struggle to survive had converged into a tension that felt almost unbearable. Every day, every hour, every sound in the forest heightened the anticipation, and she knew that the next steps she took would determine not only her immediate fate, but the unfolding of forces older and more powerful than the valley itself. Snow continued to fall, thick and unrelenting, covering tracks, masking signs, and cloaking the mountains in a deceptive stillness. The air carried a chill that penetrated to the bone, and the wind howled with a sound that seemed almost human, warning her, challenging her, reminding her that the coming confrontation would test everything she had learned. The tension was unbearable, the stakes unmistakable, and the valley itself seemed to hold its breath. The mountain man's shadow loomed over every thought, every step, every heartbeat. She tightened her cloak, gripping the edges of her pack, and peered into the forest, where shadows shifted and snow fell silently. Somewhere in the trees, the suns were moving. Somewhere beyond the peaks, the mountain man was watching, patient and calculating. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the pulse of fear, determination, and curiosity intertwining into a single thread that would carry her into the moment, when the forces she had been preparing for would finally converge. The climax of the story, she realized, was nearly upon her. The mountain, the forest, the villagers, the suns, and the mountain man himself, all of it was coming together, each step drawing her closer to a confrontation that could change everything. The first light of dawn broke over the mountains, spilling a pale gold across the snow-dusted peaks and casting long, trembling shadows over the valley below. The woman stood at the edge of the forest, her breath visible in the cold air, heart pounding with the knowledge that today would change everything. The snow, once soft and concealing, now glinted like a warning under the rising sun. And the forest seemed to hold its own breath, waiting for the inevitable. The mountain man's sons had already been spotted in the morning mist, moving with the precision and quiet strength that had unnerved her for weeks. Every step she took felt heavier, laden with anticipation, and yet through it all, she felt a resolve stronger than fear. The villagers had gathered cautiously near the edges of the valley, eyes wide with both worry and awe. They watched from a distance, uncertain, feeling the tension that had been building for weeks reach a peak they could almost touch. Families who had argued over loyalty now stood in silent unity, recognizing that the story unfolding before them was greater than any personal feud, greater than the old rivalries that had shaped their lives for generations. Even the children, drawn by curiosity and instinct, huddled close to their parents, sensing that the day carried weight and consequence unlike any other. From the shadows of the forest, the mountain man emerged, moving with a quiet authority that seemed to absorb the cold itself. His eyes swept over the valley, then fixed on the woman, and she felt that same force that had haunted her thoughts and dreams for weeks. He was no longer simply a presence. He was the pulse of the mountains, the embodiment of survival and power, and yet in his gaze, she saw something more, a recognition of strength, of resilience, of the life she had carved out for herself against impossible odds. His sons appeared behind him, emerging from the tree line like shadows that had gained substance in the light. They were formidable, moving with the skill and precision of hunters trained in ways the village could barely comprehend. Yet there was a subtle hesitation in their steps, a respect for the woman that surprised her. She had prepared for confrontation, for challenge, and for the worst. But what met her eyes now was something more complicated, a mixture of acknowledgement, caution, and something almost human beneath the raw power they all carried. For a long moment, the world seemed suspended, the valley silent except for the whisper of the wind through the pines. Then the woman stepped forward, her boots crunching in the snow, and spoke. Her voice carried steady and firm, reaching the ears of both the mountain man and the villagers. She reminded him, and perhaps herself, that survival was not only about strength, but also about understanding. negotiation, and respect for those who had lived. Endured and adapted. Her words were not a plea. They were a statement, challenge framed in the logic of experience and instinct. The mountain man did not respond immediately. For a heartbeat, the valley seemed poised on the edge of a precipice. Then he nodded once, slowly, deliberately, as if recognizing the truth of her presence, her skill, and her determination. There was no anger in his gesture, no assertion of dominance in the moment, only an acknowledgement that she had navigated the challenges he had set without faltering, and that she was not merely a passive participant in the unfolding story. His sons shifted slightly, the tension in their posture easing as well. As though the unspoken rules they had been testing were now understood, the villagers, witnessing the exchange, let out a collective breath they had been holding. Fear began to give way to cautious relief, and the air that had been thick with anticipation and unease began to clear. Families moved closer, observing the subtle reconciliation, the balance being restored between the forces that had dominated the valley for weeks. The woman and the mountain man's sons maintained a respectful distance, each aware of the potential for danger, but also of the possibilities for trust. However fragile it might be, over the next hours, careful conversations unfolded. The mountain man spoke sparingly, his voice low and deliberate, explaining the intent behind his claim, the legacy he wished to ensure, and the code by which he lived. The woman listened, absorbing every word, weighing each phrase against her own instincts and knowledge. She realized that what had seemed a threat had also been a test, a way to measure strength, patience, and wisdom. The villagers contributed their perspective cautiously, offering insights into the land, the seasons, and the survival skills that had allowed them to endure for generations. Together, they created a dialogue that honored both tradition and the present, bridging a gap that had seemed By midday/led. By midday, the snow began to soften, and the first signs of spring touched the edges of the valley. The tension that had bound the community loosened, replaced by a fragile sense of unity. The mountain man retreated to the forest, leaving his sons to interact with the villagers in measured ways, demonstrating respect for boundaries and shared knowledge. The woman, for her part, felt a profound sense of achievement, not simply in surviving, but in navigating a path that required intelligence, courage, and empathy. She had faced the forces of the mountains, the mountain man, and his legacy, and emerged with not only survival, but understanding. The village began to settle back into a rhythm, one altered by the events that had transpired, but enriched by the lessons learned. Families collaborated more closely, sharing resources and skills, and the sense of community strengthened in ways that had been absent for years. The presence of the mountain man's sons became less threatening and more a symbol of continuity and respect for the land. Their interactions with the villagers were cautious but meaningful, teaching new skills and sharing the knowledge of survival, tracking, an observation that had long been their father's domain. As weeks passed, the woman and the mountain man developed a mutual understanding that transcended words. Though their relationship had begun in conflict and fear, it evolved into a respect born of shared experience and endurance. She had learned that power could be tempered with wisdom, that survival was as much about connection and communication as it was about strength. The mountains remained formidable, wild and unpredictable, but they were no longer a source of unrelenting fear. Instead, they became a classroom, a partner in the unfolding story of the valley and its people. The villagers, too, found new courage and perspective. They had witnessed how the mountain man, and his sons could be both challenge and teacher. They began to share their own skills openly, mentor younger generations, and embrace a sense of unity that had been tested but ultimately strengthened. Their fear had not vanished, but it had been tempered by understanding, awareness, and the acknowledgement that they were part of a living, breathing system far larger than themselves in the quiet moments. As snow melted and the streams began to flow again, the woman reflected on the journey she had endured. She had faced the unknown, navigated fear, and confronted a power greater than herself. Yet through it all, she had maintained agency. learned lessons from both allies and adversaries, and discovered reserves of courage and insight she had not known existed. The mountain man's claim, once terrifying and absolute, had become a catalyst for growth, not just for her, but for the entire valley. By the time the first flowers began to push through the snow, the balance had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The mountain man remained a figure of respect and awe, his legacy secure, but the valley had grown stronger, wiser, and more cohesive. The woman stood at the edge of the forest one morning, watching the sunlight catch the peaks in gold and white, feeling the pulse of the mountains and the rhythm of life that flowed through them. She had been tested, yes, and the lessons had been harsh, but she had endured, and in doing so, had ensured that the valley would endure as well. The story closed not with triumph alone, but with reflection and understanding. The mountain man's claim had been a shock, a challenge, and a force of change, but it had revealed the strength, resilience, and wisdom of those who faced it. The villagers learned that fear could be tempered with courage, that survival required intelligence as well as strength, and that the mountains, though formidable, could teach lessons that shaped both body and mind. And the woman, standing amidst the peaks and valleys she had learned to navigate, understood that life's challenges, no matter how intense, could be met with patience, strategy, and respect for forces both human and natural. In the end, the valley was quieter but stronger, the bonds between its people firmer, and the legacy of the mountain man preserved without extinguishing the agency and courage of those who lived within it. The peaks, wild and untamed, continued to watch over the village, carrying secrets, history, and the promise of future challenges. But the story that had begun with fear and uncertainty now concluded with understanding, respect, and the reminder that even the most shocking bargains, when faced with wisdom and courage, could lead to growth, unity, and enduring strength.